Nevertheless, over some period, this was reinterpreted and given the contemporary naturalistic approach, namely, aspects of the world can be studied at various levels, and they have whatever property they have. If it's counter to our common sense intuition, too bad for our intuition. That has no status. So if, in fact, I can affect the moon by moving my arm, it sounds crazy, but if that's the way it turns out, okay. And if it turns out that the world is really n-dimensional with infinite, one-dimensional strings, well, okay, sounds crazy, but if that's the way it turns out, fine. Intuition is irrelevant. Furthermore, there are many levels at which we can study this reality, whatever it is. We're going to try to integrate them. That's the sensible version of the unification problem. There is no notion of existence or reality apart from what figures in our best explanatory theories. In particular, there is no theory at all of the physical or the material. These concepts have disappeared with Newton. Therefore, we have no coherent question to ask about what lies outside the physical. There no longer is a mind-body problem, except just by arbitrary stipulation. And the reason is there is no such thing as body. Till somebody tells us what physical means, there's no question about what lies beyond the physical, and physics has no concept of physical. It's just whatever we come to understand, or maybe more narrowly, whatever we come to understand in such a way that there's at least a reasonable prospect of integrating it with the core natural sciences. Kind of a loose idea, but there's no concept of physical or physical reality beyond that. Turning to the case of thinking or solving problems or speaking a language, right now, we are, in this sense of physical reality, we're most confident about the physical reality of computational representational systems, at least by naturalistic criteria. So let's take an actual case. There are recent studies in the case of language, interesting studies, within the study of computational representational systems, you find many different categories of expressions. I won't give details, but for example, there's a category of well-formed expressions, perfectly grammatical, and then various kinds of deviant expressions, and they fall into all sorts of different types: semantic incompatibility, violation of some principle, violation of another principle, and so on. That's internal to the study of computational representational systems. Only very recently, there's been some work on electrical activity of the brain, or called event-related potentials, in which people have, pretty surprisingly but interestingly, discovered specific correlates to these categories. So a particular kind of category of deviant expression yields a characteristic event-related potential, the specific kind of electrical activity in the brain. Well, that's kind of interesting, but why is it interesting? Well, it's interesting because notice that the thing we're committed to from a scientific point of view is the categories of expressions given by the computational representational system. Those are the categories that come out of a background of theoretical explanation and empirical justification and so on. The event-related potentials are just curiosity. I mean, what's interesting about them is that they correlate with what we understand to some extent, and therefore maybe they're interesting. Notice these are two studies of the brain at two different levels. One, it's electrical activity. One, it's computational activity. In the case of the computational activity, we have reasonably well-grounded theories with explanatory character and so on. In the case of the electrical activity, we know nothing, just a lot of noise up there. But now the study of the electrical activity of the brain has made progress because it has found something that correlates with what we understand much better, namely the computational representational systems. Now, maybe if these correlations are extended and placed in a richer theoretical framework, we'll actually begin to rely on them for some inquiry that'll tell us something about the computational representational systems, but that's the order of priority and groundedness from the point of view of the natural sciences. The usual I'm stressed that because the usual interpretation, again, is the opposite, and mistakenly. Of course, in this naturalistic approach, we would never ask such utterly pointless questions as whether airplanes fly, or whether computers think, or whether algorithms see triangles, or whatever. Now, what are the real empirical questions and the reasonable research programs? Well, I think they're the ones sketched earlier. It seems to me if we want to learn something about humans or pigeons or whatever, we should begin by considering something that they do well, and we should try to figure out how they do what they do well. We postulate some particular faculty of the mind, meaning the brain at a relevant level of abstraction. We try to determine its properties in its mature state, stable state, and its initial state. We look at the problems of state transitions, learning and growth, the problems of interpretation in a fixed state, the receptive problems, the problems of execution of action insofar as that study is feasible, which is not very far, in fact virtually nothing. We look at the problems of unification, one of them being the integration of various levels of inquiry, the other the question of the integration of cognitive systems. The first question we expect, it's just our scientific faith in unity of nature or something, we expect that there's going to be an answer to the first question, whether we can find it or not, but there's no particular reason to expect an answer to the second. There may be or there may not be. If there isn't, there's no unified cognitive science. For the moment, there's real progress in a few areas, including vision at the computational representational level, and in this case also at the cellular level. There's progress in language, but almost solely at the computational representational level, and some performance things like acquisition. There's studies of conceptual development, closely related to language, which are quite interesting. There's studies of probabilistic reasoning and error and various other topics. There are all sorts of areas where there's interesting results concerning human cognitive function. As far as I'm aware, all within the framework of highly modular assumptions, which, as I said, seem to be natural. But apart from, we're very far from any understanding of the articulation, the architecture, the general structure of the mind-brain, apart from a very few specific modules which appear to have their own special design. That leaves most of the questions one might like to ask enshrouded in mystery. And it's entirely possible that this is mystery of a kind that a human intelligence, which after all has its own specific biological properties, is unable to penetrate, even in principle. Thanks. Anybody wants to say things? There are a couple of microphones around. Yep. Yep. I think if you move over, it will be easier.
About up?
Yeah.
That good?
Sort of.
How about that?
Yeah, perfect.
My name is George Watson. I got about 3 things on my mind. One, when you get back to MIT and see your buddy study, when you get back to MIT and you see your buddy studying the nematodes, you can pass along to him that you got it from a farmer in North Carolina.
You have what? I'm sorry.
You can pass along to him that he got it from a farmer in North Carolina. That
really?
Not go put them in the soybeans. He'll never get his crop to market.
That's interesting. I didn't have any idea what they were until I read this paper. Glad to know they exist.
The second thing on my mind is I want to thank you. I'll probably never see you again, and I'll explain. About 1973, 74, I started reading your writings on transformational generative grammar, and I noticed that about every other paragraph on the page you put a colon behind the verb. And I said, I made a command decision. I said, well, if Chomsky can do it, I can too. And I started. That got me into linguistics and International Phonetic Alphabet. And basically, my word of thanks to you is that today I write what I think the way I want to. I haven't looked up a punctuation rule or a grammar rule since then.
Glad to have some impact on the world.
And my attitude toward the prescriptionist is if they don't like it, that's more of a judgment of them than me. I don't care. But you started me thinking. I said, good gracious, if the way I have been taught the structure of the language is wrong, what's the impact on the interpretation of the meaning? And I had to start going back through everything again. I got more out of philosophy the second time around than I did the first. Didn't understand it the first time. I began to understand a little bit the second. For instance, you talked about the 17th century. I went back and read John Donne, and for the first time I understood what he was saying in his poetry. And I remember people falling out like flies trying to read it the first time when I was in undergraduate school. But you triggered a change of thinking in me, and I'm happy today thanks to it. I wanted to say that. The third thing is I got a question. This is more along the lines of what you were saying last night. 74, oil embargo, gasoline went sky high, interest went up, everything went high. President Carter came in. You'd think, man, being a peanut farmer, he'd have had sense enough not to put an embargo on the soybeans when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, but he did, and we don't have those markets today, thanks to a dumb peanut farmer from Georgia. I mean, this stuff matters in things like trade deficits. We started losing our smokestack industries, at least that's what I was reading in the papers about 82, 3, 4, and 5. We were going to become an information society and a service society, and I noticed that we started laying off people fiercely here of late. IBM 20,000, GM 74,000. The car manufacturers, which people always consider stable companies in this country, are got these horrendous problems. But my question is, what is the trend? What are the trends that are going on that we still aren't picking up on because we don't have the cognitive interpretation process figured out well enough to look at the evidence to tell us what's really going on? Because my instincts are telling me that the infrastructure of our society is being heavily damaged. And with that, I'll quit.
Yeah, it's more than an instinct. I mean, every statistic and study will tell you exactly the same thing. But only one comment. I think I'll just make a suggestion for thinking about this. I think you should be more skeptical about the use of the word we. When you say we are losing our infrastructure, we are becoming an information society, we are losing industry. Who's we? Is we the investors who own those industries? Well, they're not losing it. They're just transferring them elsewhere. So suppose that auto parts are being produced in Mexico, let's say, or computers are being chips are being produced in Taiwan or something, and it's being done by industries with corporate offices in New York. Well, from the point of view of the worker in the United States, yeah, you're losing your industry. From the point of view of the owner, you're not losing industry at all. You're just making more profit out of it with cheaper labor. Now, it just happens that the people who own the industry are the ones who are setting the policy, by and large. So it's not too surprising that you get the consequences you see. And in order to understand it, it seems to me the first thing we got to do is be willing to kind of disentangle ourselves from the webs of ideology enough so that we at least ask who the reference is when we talk about we. From the point of view of people who are making the decisions about social planning, what happens to the country isn't all that important. What happens to the profits and power of those who dominate it, that is important, and those two things may very well diverge. I think they've diverged pretty sharply in the last 10 years.
Steve Kemp, gracious enough to answer a question from last night. I have about 2 days ago. It
Okay.
took me at least 20 hours to formulate the question. One of your principal arguments for the innateness of a specialized modular capacity for language is the rapidity with which a child acquires language. And one thing that struck me from your talk was that the statement, the child acquires language rapidly, is interest relative in exactly the same fashion that the statement, Boston is near to New York, which was your example. Mm-hmm. And how do you answer some mind-brain functionalist who comes to you and says, the child acquires language excruciatingly slowly. We have this huge neural net. There are billions of synapse firings and billions of weight changes. I'm not real good with the neuromythos. If it is genuinely interest relative and is the child acquires language rapidly is only a true statement within some shared interest, how do you establish between yourself and this mind-brain person a shared interest that establishes that your statement is true?
That's a very good point. In fact, when I say that language is acquired very rapidly, you're absolutely right. That's like John is almost home. What's rapidly? That's only meant to stimulate your imagination. It's not meant as a proposal. The way to answer the question is to construct an explicit proposal as to how the language is acquired. Now, there are specific proposals based on innate structure. There are no specific proposals based on these nets, so the argument's over. If somebody can propose, it's kind of what I was saying before, if somebody can propose a general learning mechanism or some kind of a network or something that does anything, then we'll have something to talk about. So far, the only thing we have is highly specific structures, and when I give these qualitative comments about it's done rapidly, I simply mean to say, look, what else would you expect? If children are picking up 12 words a day, and every single one of them, meaning on one presentation, and every single one of them has the intricate complexity that I only barely began to illustrate in the case of one word, and if the same is true of structural properties, what else would you expect? In fact, what do you expect below the neck? So true, those are only qualitative comments, and they're not supposed to convince anybody, just sort of make you think that what seems to be the case is pretty natural. But the real answer is, let's try. Let's construct a theory that tries to explain why, I take the sentences I gave last time, why does John is too clever to expect anyone to talk to mean precisely what it does? People know that without any evidence. That's easy to show. They know it before they've ever been presented with such expressions. So let's look for a theory that accounts for that. There is one theory based on principles which are pretty well established. They apply in a lot of different languages. They seem to work, and so on and so forth. That gives an answer. Somebody can come along and say, well, I think it's neural nets. Well, that's fine. Maybe it's angels, too. But tell me how.
I had sort of a brainstorm just now. I wasn't here last night. A friend of mine recorded that for me, hopefully. But what the first gentleman stood up and said caused me to think, and something you said, or kind of a general theme or motif during your talk today, really struck an interesting chord with me. The idea that we seem to be directing our energy studying things that people don't do very well, and that maybe we could learn more by studying things that people do well. That seems to point to something on even a mundane level for me. I get the feeling that a lot of the what might be called infrastructural problems of society today are, when it comes down to it, moral problems. What we treat as economics problems and these sorts of things really, I think, ultimately have to be solved on a moral level. And I believe that will have to do with people concentrating on things that humans do well. And when I think about it, I think that a lot of the things that people do well are very simple, subtle things that people also take for granted, and that most of the people in this world seem to be running around trying to impress each other by doing things better that people don't do very well. I just wonder what you thought about this kind of thinking.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the implications of what you're saying. I mean, it does seem to me I agree with particular statements. We ought to be studying the things that people do well if we want to understand people. I also agree that the problems of society are in substantial part moral problems, but only in the sense that when we plan our actions, we try to change things or whatever, we're doing it in terms of some kind of moral values. We ought to be as clear about that as we can, some conception of what's right for people and so on, and it's good to be clear about that. But beyond that, I don't know where to go. I mean, I think these subjects are too intellectually thin for deep analysis to carry us very far. You work pretty much by instinct and intuition. I think that most people tend to agree on these instincts and intuitions when you sort of clear away a lot of ideological cover. And if you want to sort of work with other people about it or clarify your own ideas or whatever, you want to find that level at which you have agreement about moral values and then ask yourself rational questions like, given those moral values and given the way society actually is, what should I be doing to make it adapt better to those moral values? That's being a responsible human being, whether it's in a small area like the family or a big area like international affairs.
Let me try to clarify a little bit more. I guess I use the word moral because I tend to think of things moral as being really more practical and taking place on a simpler level. I guess that's the idea of that thought. But when I say that a lot of people in the world seem to be concentrating on doing things that people don't do well, and they should be concentrating on things that people do well, the examples that you gave of what people do well were things like, well, walking and talking and very simple things like this, whereas the examples of things that people don't do well are things like pole vaulting and maybe perhaps spending a great deal of money to go to Mars by the year 2000.
Well, going to Mars is certainly not something people do well, but I don't think that answers the question whether we ought to be doing it or not. The question is there any point in people going to Mars? Well, you go back and have a look at the origins of that program, and I think you get a pretty straight answer to that question. That program originally came out of the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy needed a political victory to overcome the effect of that, and he decided to set up a big crusade, the Apollo program. We got this fantastic thing. We're going to put a man on the moon. Was there any point to that? Well, there was a big point for the electronics industry. They made a killing out of it. There was a big point for a lot of, scientists who got huge research grants. But there is a question. Did it make sense to put a man on the moon as distinct from a little receptor of some kind? You put a bunch of receptors on the moon, you don't have to worry about an oxygen support system and, precautions for survival and so on and so forth. It's obviously going to be vastly cheaper and vastly easier from an engineering point of view. Will you get any less information? In other words, is a man the best instrument to be on the moon? Well, scientists will have to answer that, but I'm quite certain the answer is no, that a human being is probably a very poor instrument to be on the moon. The choice of human beings on the moon was to have something dramatic, to have something that could get people excited and distract them from their own problems and subordinate them to power and and give a shot to the electronics industry and so on. That was the motive for it, and that doesn't make any sense, except, for IBM maybe. But those, it seems to me, are the kind of questions that one should ask, not is it the kind of things people do well or badly. Sometimes the kinds of things people do badly are worth doing. Like, say, quantum physics is the kind of things that people do badly. That's why there's so few people who can do it well. It's kind of like pole vaulting, kind of a quirk. Some people can do it, most people can't. But that's worth doing.
You put me in mind of a possible modification of Turing's test, which, if you follow cartoons, I'll call the Mark Allen Stomati test, which is whether you can tell the difference between the cliché-generating program and your typical political candidate.
The typical political candidate has more insults.
That's very true. In fact, R.A. Lafferty wrote a science fiction story where all the insults had been standardized. And so they would say, my opponent is an 8 and a 3, and the reply would be, my opponent is a 4 and a 6.
Save a lot of television time.
Exactly. I want to ask you what may not be quite a question, but when you talked about this wonderful program which had generated more, whatever it was, excitement, interest than anything in the history of the intellectual world, or whatever it was they said, it reminded me of a conversation that Dr. Stam over at NC State had with a student that I witnessed some years ago, and the student said to Dr. Stam, when are we going to have workable fusion energy? And Dr. Stam said, well, maybe in 50 years, maybe in 100 years, I don't know. And the student said, well, why do we always see all these things in the paper about fusions just around the corner, great breakthrough, et cetera, et cetera? And Dr. Stam replied, you have to say such things in order to get your research grants.
That's kind of like the quote that I gave, except in that case, at least there's something real going on. In this case, the advertising is not obviously for anything real at all.
Well, I guess the question, or possibly non-question I want to ask is, there obviously is a good bit of research money going into these AI folk. And, a lot of people pay good money to make chess-playing programs. It's a funny thing. I found, I was working with a friend of mine's commercial one, and the thing was awfully cowardly. And I found that if I told it to make a move that I thought might work, and then let it keep me from getting killed, then it worked pretty well. But if you just let it work, it took forever to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, I must say I didn't say much about it, but I'll just give my own opinion. On the question of chess-playing programs, I only described the way I thought one ought to evaluate them. One ought to first ask, is it an interesting question at the current moment of science to figure out how people play chess? The answer to that's probably no. It's not an interesting question at the current phase of our understanding of the mind. But let's assume for the sake of argument that it is an interesting question. So just for the sake of argument. Then we take a look at some program that, say, does as well as Kasparov or, Grandmaster. And we ask, does that program tell us anything about the way humans do it? And the answer to that is flat no. They're designed so as not to tell us anything about the way humans do it. The programs are designed to exploit the capacities of computers, which are very different than the capacities of humans. So they have deep search and fast, big memory and all that kind of stuff. So we therefore throw out the systems instantly, at least on scientific grounds, because they don't do anything. So they're studying what's probably a dumb question, and they're giving an answer which is totally useless. So what's the point? Well, as far as I can see, the only point is either advertising and getting research grants, or maybe taking the fun out of playing chess. If there's some other point, I don't know what it is. I've felt this for about 40 years, I should say, and I've never been able to convince anybody, so maybe I'm wrong. The general attitude remains the one that I quoted from Herbert Simon, that this is the sort of core, it's like Drosophila, it's the sort of fundamental question in the field. Unless, as far as I can see and have always felt, it's a totally pointless question. It's just a waste of time. Maybe something useful will come out on the side. Like maybe by accident it'll have some spin-offs. Like, maybe it'll help somebody figure out more complicated software ideas or something. Anything can always have side effects. But as a research program, it doesn't seem to me make any sense. If that's the core program of the field, then I think we have to just get rid of the field.
Okay. Let me try to ask my possible question here then. In your talk about, in this talk, you've described the natural science methods and ways of doing things that are useful, but then obviously a lot of research money is going into these things which are apparently much less useful.
Useful isn't quite the point. Insightful, I think, is the thing. A lot of things are worth doing even though they're not useful because they give you understanding. Mm-hmm. Understanding is a value in itself. But these things don't even give you any understanding. All they do is maybe fool people or something like that.
So what I'm wondering is there a connection, in your opinion, or what do you think of the idea that there might be a connection between the kinds of things that get funded that lack real progress in science and the kinds of things that get funded in the economy and politics and so on.
Well, first of all, I don't regard this stuff as science. So,
good
I mean,
point.
I don't know if that's obvious from what I was saying, but most of it doesn't seem to me science at all. It seems to me kind of hype, or maybe sort of badly organized engineering or something like that. But within real science, people make mistakes, but I think there's sort of reasonable interaction about what's the right thing to do on sort of a rational basis. I mean, there's self-advertising and power trips and so on and so forth, but when you move towards subjects that have more intellectual substance, you move towards more integrity. Not because the people have better genes, but because nature's a hard taskmaster and it doesn't allow you to fake. So the more you understand, the harder it is to fake. So you get more honesty, just kind of like that. In areas like, say, the economy and political decisions and so on, the stuff is usually for power interest. Doesn't have anything to do with only marginal things to do. It's kind of very low order factors are things like human significance or anything like that, which again is pretty, not terribly surprising. If you just look at the institutional structures of the society, who's in a position to influence decisions, what their institutional roots are, well, sort of predicted kind of untrivial assumptions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to close with this comment. If somebody makes a computer that can do the sort of analysis that you do, then I'll believe they've achieved something.
Don't forget, you can't design programs that do simple things like talking like a 2-year-old.
Hi. I wanted to raise a point with the chess-playing computer again. I think I would take issue with the fact, or with your opinion, that they're useless right now, or they don't tell us anything. I think I might be looking at it the wrong way. To say that a computer plays chess, but it doesn't model human thought, makes it useless. I don't think so.
Pointless, not useless. It would be useless even if it did model human thought. Maybe it would be interesting, but it would be useless if it modeled human thought. I'm suggesting it's not only useless, which is not necessarily a major criterion, but pointless.
But isn't it possible, if you look at it from a different viewpoint, to say, can we design a machine that can solve a problem within a limited domain that humans have difficulty with? In which case, I think a chess-playing computer does very well.
There's no point to designing programs that will solve, in general, that will solve problems within limited domains. There would only be, that's like an engineering problem. I'm saying, wouldn't it be useful to build a big machine? Well, not in itself. If you build a big machine that helps you make a bridge or something, yeah, then it was useful. But there was no point in building a big machine. And similarly, there's no point in constructing a program that will solve some arbitrary problem. That you can do, undoubtedly. For example, it's trivial. You can do it in your spare time if you've taken the first semester of computer science to write a program that'll run through some decision procedure for some simple part of mathematics. Sure. Yeah, you can do that. Like once you learn the decision procedure and you learn how to program, you can do it. So what?
But maybe we're on taking steps towards something because...
Maybe, but that has to be shown. See, that's as if somebody came along and constructed some big machine and said, well, look at this big machine I constructed. Maybe it's a step towards something useful. Well, maybe, but I'll wait until I see.
Okay. Well, my point is that it seems kind of selfish to think that the only intelligence that we can have, or the only way we can solve very, very complex problems, is to use the human brain.
That's not true. Nobody believes that. You want to do weather forecasting, you're not going to use the human brain. You'll use all kind of statistical analysis of weather patterns, certainly using computers going way beyond the human brain. That's not anything to do with intelligence. That's, you want to solve a particular problem, you look for the best methods of doing it. For example, if you want to solve the decision problem for some elementary branch of mathematics, you'll use the decision procedure. That's not the way humans do it.
Right.
But that's because you have a goal. You want to solve that problem for whatever reason. So there's nothing to say that we only... See, the reason you try to understand what humans are doing is because you're interested in human beings.
Right.
If you're interested in human beings, you want to understand what humans are doing. That's tautological. If you're interested in solving a problem, you try to solve that problem. Okay, like if there was a purpose to playing chess, if there was a purpose to winning chess championships, that had some significance.
Well, I think chess is just a convenient setting to
do what?
To try algorithmic methods for doing quick searches.
There's zillions of possible algorithms. I mean, you make a slightly different game, you make up a different algorithm. There's no point to it. It's like building machines to do arbitrary tasks.
I think there is a point to it.
Well, what's the point?
The point is that we know if it's doing a good job or not.
No, but look, we can set up endless numbers of tasks, and we can design computer machines to do those tasks, and we can do it forever. There's no point.
Well,
there's no point to doing arbitrary tasks. Sometimes it may turn out that having tried an arbitrary task, you'll get something of some value, but you got to show that. So like suppose somebody said, look, I can build a machine which will, randomly interchange the chairs in this room, and I can do it very effectively. Well, maybe he can, maybe he can't. Is there any point in building it?
Well, I would argue that the point for chess-playing computers is that they experiment with, well, there are two, I think, theories right now. One is the chunking theory that Berliner uses, and there's the other one which just kills it with hardware.
Yeah. And neither theory has any intellectual interest or is related to any problem that we know about.
That's an opinion.
Well, if you can show that it is, you got to show it.
Well,
not just here's the way I do it, therefore it's worth doing. If you have to say, look, here's the way I do it, and there's some reason why it's worth knowing the answer to that question. Tell me the reason. The reason can't be that it beats somebody at a chess game, because that's of no interest.
Well, what I'm saying is that maybe we could use these.
Maybe, but maybe the guy who designs the machine to randomize the chairs in the room will get something that's useful for some purpose too. Who knows?
Okay.
I mean, just pick that at random. Pick anything else you like. Take any test you like, any crazy test you like. You could work on a machine that would do it as fast as possible. And, it's not inconceivable that as a result of having done that absurd thing, something useful might come out. But that's not the way you do science.
Okay.
I mean, unless you can't think of anything to do for your thesis, then maybe just pick something at random.
Well,
look, compare it with Drosophila. People in genetics didn't study Drosophila because, let's do something at random. They looked at Drosophila because they had particular questions to ask and they wanted to know the answers to them. And Drosophila happened to be the right system, the best system as far as I knew, to get those answers. Similarly, this guy who was looking at nematodes didn't just say, okay, I'll try to say something about nematodes. He picked them because they're the simplest organism with a wiring diagram worked out, and he wanted to know something about wiring diagrams. I mean, if you're doing rational inquiry, you're trying to understand something, and you organize your task, your research program, so it may lead you to understanding. You don't just do something in the hope that something will turn out.
Well, I don't think that's true right now.
Well, what is the goal?
Well, what we have in the world we have a huge environment, and we have to do, if you want to maybe compute it, is you have to be able to make searches from a wide variety of places. I mean, we have so many choices we can do. I can walk back to my chair, I can stand here, I could skip back to my chair. We have
so why not study that? I mean, I don't think there's any point in studying that either, because there's no question.
What I'm saying is there's a multitude of choices.
Yeah, but look, there's endless numbers of areas where you can set up problems with multitude of choices. Why pick this one? You only pick this one if you think you're going to learn something from it. See, if the model really is Drosophila, then let's do what the biologist did with Drosophila. Ask a question that's worth having an answer to, show that chess playing is the way to answer that question, then go ahead. But nobody's doing that.
Okay, I'll say no mas right now.
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me anyway. Yeah.
The Turing test is fooled by algorithmic systems, or I believe you said something like that. Well, how will we know when we do have an intelligent computer? Talk to it longer?
No, we're not. We won't ever know whether we have an intelligent computer any more than we will know whether we have an airplane that flies. It's a meaningless question, exactly as Turing said. Suppose I ask you this question. Let's say we're back in 1908, or whatever the first right thing was. And suppose somebody came along and said, suppose I make something that goes up in the air, how are we going to know if it flies? That's just a dumb question, It'll fly. There's no question as to whether it's going to fly. If you want to call that stuff flying, okay, it's flying. In English, you happen to decide to call it flying. In some other language, you call it something else. But there is no empirical question as to whether an airplane flies. And there is no empirical question as to whether an algorithm thinks, for exactly the same reason. Flying is something birds do, at least if you talk in English. And thinking is something humans do. It's sort of embedded in a big matrix of human interests and so on. And just as airplanes don't do whatever it is birds are doing, even if they could fool somebody into thinking that it's a bird, that would be irrelevant. Similarly, algorithms or brains are not doing things that humans do. For example, is there a question as to whether brains think? Well, brains don't think. Of course they don't think. My brain doesn't see triangles.
I think humans.
So how about my brain? Let's forget computers. My brain doesn't see triangles for trivial reasons. Seeing triangles is a human action. We attribute that characterization to humans in a framework of human interests and concerns and motives. This notion is of absolutely no use for science. I mean, we don't study in the sciences things like thinking any more than we study things like desks in the sciences. I mean, these are concepts of common sense. They don't belong in the sciences. They don't enter into rational explanatory theories. So in the sciences, you're constantly trying to get rid of all these things and move to concepts that have some utility, not things like desk or thinking or something like that, or digestion. You know, you look at what's actually happening, try to understand it in terms of whatever concepts and principles are relevant. But to ask the question whether a program thinks or whether a brain sees a triangle is as dumb as asking whether an airplane flies. It is not going to have an answer for trivial reasons. There is no answer to the question whether airplanes fly, and there's no point setting up an analog of the Turing test that says, well, can we construct something that's going to fool a human under some circumstances? That won't tell us whether it's flying or not.
But if you say you think, I presume, and what if we make a machine with, say, attributes like the human brain, very complicated...
Well, the human brain has attributes like the human brain, and the human brain doesn't think.
Well, humans think.
Humans do, but human brains don't. Any more than your brain sees a triangle. Your brain doesn't see a triangle for quite uninteresting reasons. Correspondingly, something with the characteristics of your brain doesn't see a triangle. People are the ones who do things like that, just as Turing said. Now, you can ask pointless questions, like what will be the empirical conditions under which an airplane flies. If you ask a pointless question, you're never going to get an answer, of course. Now, it's interesting that in the, dealing with sort of phenomenal world, like airplanes and flying, nobody asks those silly questions. I mean, if somebody tried to start a new science dealing with the question whether airplanes fly, they'd be laughed out of, nobody would even bother laughing.
Well, there really were standards for the human flight contest. There were some standards.
Yes,
but
you don't ask whether you don't even ask whether humans can fly. Suppose somebody came along and said, how do we know that humans can't fly? Take a look at the last Olympics. Some guy went 30 feet. Why isn't that flying? It's only one order of magnitude less than chicken. It's just a dumb question. It has no answers. It's a matter of decision whether we want to call that flying or not.
In a couple of recent papers by Norman Holland at Gainesville, he argues that your grammar renders Saussure so out of date that that your grammar renders the grammar of the Frenchman Saussure so out of date that much of the recent French intellectual excitement is also rather pointless. Do you have any ideas about that? Have you seen the papers at Holland? Yes. Okay.
This Norman Holland?
Yeah. Do you have any speculations that you'd like to share with us today on that topic?
It's very hard for me to comment on the French intellectual scene since I understand almost no word of anything that's happened there for many, many years. So,
okay.
About whether or not there's unification within the cognitive sciences. Do you find any usefulness at all in Gestalt theory and Jungian archetypes?
Well, it's actually many of the ideas of Gestalt theory were developed in a sort of a crazy context, admittedly, but nevertheless developed back in the 17th century discussions. There was a lot of discussion of, you read people like, say, Ralph Cudworth, and if you're willing to plow through all the strange framework and funny ideas, what you see is an analysis of perception in terms of notions like optimal forms, causal factors, figure ground. I mean, a lot of the ideas that later came up again in Gestalt psychology. And there's probably something to all those ideas. In fact, some of them are even beginning to be understood. As far as the Jungian archetypes are concerned, I don't claim to understand a lot of it. I've tried to read it because as far as I know, Jung, as far as I've been able to determine, he's one of the very few people who ask questions about innate structure of knowledge systems, which is interesting. Most people haven't asked such questions. But whether there's anything to those answers, I don't know.
I was wondering, you said that there's no purpose in studying things that we don't do good, that we do bad.
Pardon?
You said that there's no purpose in studying something we don't perform well.
If you want to learn about us, there may be a purpose for some other reason.
But if you take an algorithm and you see when this algorithm collapses, I mean, first of all, there's so much effort in this direction. I wonder how could you just dismiss it like this, just saying there's no pointless. There's so much research in vision, studying visual illusions and trying to deduce, I mean, even the Stroop effect. You're taking an effect, you see when our system collapses, and then you try and deduce facts from it. And I just don't...
But seeing illusions is something we do very well.
Yeah, but...
We do it perfectly. In fact, that's why it's studied. You give it a Necker cube, everybody sees it instantly. That's why people study a Necker cube.
Yeah, but an illusion is an example of a situation where our algorithm for calculating something is collapses. You can do the same thing, visuals in decision behavior. You can say that when people are intransitive, they perform some kind of an illusion because they grasp the reality in a different thing, and then you could try and deduce things about the algorithm that really exist in there that collapse under these circumstances, and maybe you can learn something about the algorithms.
Well, the fact that maybe you'll learn something about algorithms is not interesting. People study illusions, or people study, say, Tversky-style studies of probabilistic errors, because that's something that people do perfectly, and they all do it, and they tend to do it alike. People do it fast, instantaneously, and of course wrong, but wrong from another point of view, from the point of view of what the objective right answer is. That's not the issue. The point is studying, say, illusions. Like studying, let's take even simpler than illusions. Take the study of apparent motion. Okay. No, that's apparent motion means, a couple of dots on a tachistoscope that show up and people look at it and they see a line. Well, what they're seeing is wrong from the point of view of the physical source. There wasn't any line. There were just 2 points. But you're studying something that people do extremely well, very rapidly, quickly, without training. They all do it alike. You give them 2 points in a particular relation, they see a line. So therefore you want to learn something about humans, that's a good thing to study.
Yeah, but wrong and bad in this direction are also wrong and bad are very similar in this direction.
It's just a terminological confusion. What people do extremely well is misinterpret that illusion, and that's why you study it. But chess is not like that.
No,
chess is a task.
I'm not talking about chess.
Well, what are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about the fact that I think basically the confusion is between what you call good and what I call. You mean fast or accurate or coherent?
No, I mean the kinds of. There are certain kinds of action that people do naturally, and they do it alike, and they do it fast, and they do it without training, and so on.
And this
That's what I mean. Things that people do well. Now, among those things are, for example, misinterpreting illusions. Okay, but they're in that category. It's just a terminological confusion.
But if we do something bad, doesn't it mean that our system in some way collapses under these circumstances? For instance,
no, it didn't collapse. If you see 2 points on a tachistoscope as a line, your system didn't collapse. It just gave a conclusion which happened to be inaccurate. But that's not the system. The system's working perfectly. The system's working perfectly. We might want to understand how it works. And in fact, a good deal of contemporary vision studies deals with just those things, and has learned a lot about the systems because those are things that people do well. In fact, David Marr, who I quoted, whose point was that you should study things that people do well, was studying exactly those things, because those are things that people do well, namely misinterpret illusions in characteristic ways.
So I don't understand. My definition of what people are doing badly is your definition of what people are doing well.
Okay, let's just settle our own terminology. We're only having a notational dispute. As long as we understand what category we're identifying. Okay, the category of recognizing straight lines in an apparent motion experiment is category 1, and pole vaulting and doing chess is category 2, and running mazes, that's category 2. Now, Marr is saying, and I agree with him, we should study category 1. If you don't like my terminology for describing it, I don't have any stake in the terminology.
I'm sorry, I will have to cut in. I'm sorry, Noam Chomsky has another. Okay.
One last person. Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned in the beginning of your talk about ways that humans represent their knowledge of the world, which I presume you mean that they've gained through experience.
No, I don't mean that. That's an open question. I would assume that most of our knowledge of the world is not gained through experience. It's for the same reasons that most of our knowledge of language isn't, or for the same reasons that most of our physical structure isn't.
Well, okay, what I wanted to ask is how that related your idea about modules, that like separate modules.
Nobody knows. This is, knowledge of sort of knowing about the world is so diffuse. Here we're just guessing. My guess is that that's going to break down into many different modules. Okay, but so little is known about it that, we're just talking up in the air.
What I really wondered was whether connections might be thought of as a way of understanding how that knowledge is.
Well, let me come back to what this guy, Charles Rockland, said. In the study of an 800-cell organism with 300 neurons, where the wiring diagram is worked out, the connectionist models are far too abstract and far too remote from physical reality to tell you anything. We now ask the question, in the case of a system of 10 to the 11th neurons, where we don't know anything about it, might these systems be physically real? Well, it's not ruled out, but I don't think one's scientific intuition would lead one to be very hopeful.
Okay, this completes the circle of talks that Noam has given here at the university, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank him on the behalf of the whole university community for these engaging speeches and interviews. Thank you.